right. Hi, everyone. This is Sterling Harris. As Jen said, I'm the Chief Deputy Director here at COVA. For those of you who know our boss, Nancy Lewis, I always like to say that the biggest part of my job is just trying to keep up with Nancy Lewis. And even though I'm going to be the lead presenter today, Jen is also a part of our Public Policy Committee, and she's done a lot of public policy work on her own prior to coming to COVA, so there'll be times I ask her to chime in, and you will hear again and again how collaborative COVA's policy efforts are. And so there are a couple caveats to our presentation today. Number one, the challenge of having a public policy updates training in December is that the legislative session starts in January in Colorado. So we don't know what we don't know, but there are definitely things that we are anticipating. We know some things that will likely change on a dime. So I'm going to do the best that I can in order to tell you everything that I know thus far. There will be things that I do not know. COVA has a public policy committee that we'll talk about here in a couple slides that we've got about 20 people when we're all able to get into the room together, and the wealth of knowledge that everyone brings is pretty amazing. And so if and when there are things that you want to know that I can't answer, I will take down that information. I'll follow up with you after the webinar. So some of what we are going to talk about today is we're going to have a little mini civics lesson about how the state legislative process works. I will be perfectly honest that I had to brush up on a few things as well, because there are specific points that COVA typically gets involved and things that we aren't that involved in. We'll talk a little bit about how COVA works on public policy. We will talk about legislation we're anticipating in 2018 and the contextual background. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and so it's kind of important to understand the backdrop. We'll talk about the Colorado Victims' Rights Caucus, which is something that COVA worked to create 6 years ago, and we're pretty proud of. And then we'll spend a good chunk of time talking about how you can get involved and stay involved. Because I am bringing a lot of information that I want to make sure I get right, I do have like a sea of paper in front of me. If at any time my paper shuffling gets too distracting, please just type in something into the chat box and Jen will give me a heads up that I need to stop it. So the very first thing we're going to talk about is how a bill becomes a law in Colorado. I am very much a child of the 80s and 90s, as you will see from the memes and graphics that I have thrown in through here. So this little guy is from Schoolhouse Rock. Some of you might know it. I'm sure you can find it on the YouTube if you want to check it out. So the Colorado legislature has 100 members. There are 35 senators and 65 representatives. There are 2 chambers, the Senate and the House. So each legislator serves on several committees, and they are appointed to those positions by his or her political party's leadership. The committee that generally hears bills of interest to COVA, it's mainly the Judiciary Committee in both the House and the Senate. Sometimes we see bills that will come up in like Health and Human Services, and I think there's like a committee on that focuses on mental health, but primarily most of our time is spent in the Judiciary Committee. There is also something that's called it's actually the State Military and Veteran Affairs Committee. It's also called the Kill Committee by a lot of people. They do hear bills that are relevant to that committee, but it is also a place when legislators want bills to just go away. Sometimes bills are sent there. Sometimes surprising things happen in that committee, so we end up following the State Affairs Committee as well. So most bills that we are interested in, the way that right now Senate Judiciary is where a lot of our bills start. Bills with a fiscal impact are usually heard in the Committee of Origin and in the Appropriations Committee. So the process is that passage of a bill requires a majority of 33 votes in the House and 18 votes in the Senate. So first we start with an introduction of a bill either in the House or the Senate. So a senator or a representative introduces a bill as the bill's sponsor, and other legislators may sign on as co-sponsors, and a bill has to have a House sponsor and a Senate sponsor. Then there's first reading. We typically aren't very involved with first reading, but just, this is our civics lesson. So the bill is read in the House or Senate, wherever it's introduced, and it's given a number and a committee assignment. So you'll get action alerts from COVA that will be, say, support House Bill 1352, and that's where that number is assigned. So then a bill might also be assigned to more than one committee. So committee hearings are where COVA is typically involved, and often where we ask you as our constituents to get involved. So the committee reviews the bill in a hearing, and supporters and opponents can testify for or against the bill. Citizens can attend the hearing and testify on the bill. The committee decides whether to amend the bill, and that either involves adding language, taking language out, substituting language, and voting on the amendment. They can vote on it as introduced. They vote to either pass the bill, they can refer it to another committee, or they can kill the bill. The proper term for killing the bill is to postpone indefinitely, or PI. So then if a bill makes it out of committee hearing, it goes to second reading. And that means it goes to the House or Senate floor, depending on which chamber it was introduced in. Then it's read to the entire House or Senate. The legislators can amend the bill and vote on the amendment. Then they vote on it, and if it's killed on the floor, it's considered lost. But if it makes it out, then it goes to something called third reading. I will say by the time things reach second reading, COVA tends to either focus our attention to what's going to happen in the next House, or sometimes it's starting to get a little hard to manage if a bill has gone through one chamber, gone to the other, and by the time it makes it to third reading, that's where things are a little harder to work with. But again, things are always very surprising down at the Capitol. So once it goes through third reading, if it dies, then it's done for that year. Or if it makes it out, then it has to go to the other side of, if it started and made it through the House, then it has to go to the Senate, and the whole process repeats over again. So sometimes you will have a bill that passes both chambers, but the versions of the bill are different, and so then the bill has to go to a conference committee. Both the House and Senate leaders appoint conference committee members who try to work out the differences, and then they end up with one compromise bill. The compromise bill then goes back to both chambers for final votes. If the bill makes it through, then it goes to the governor, and that is where the governor can either sign it or the governor can veto it, and that's the final say. So that is, it's this neat, tidy list on this slide. And then this is the document that you're able to download if you want to. This is kind of the messy process of what it looks like. I almost didn't include this graphic because it's really hard to read, but it also shows it's a pretty good representation of how many steps and how chaotic this process can sometimes feel, which I think is probably a big deterrent about why more people aren't involved in the legislative process. So, COVA, public policy, and you. COVA's policy committee, these days we meet year-round. We didn't always. I think COVA's history with working on public policy, it's been a part of what we do since our inception in 1982. We know that most of you on the phone are probably victim advocates. We definitely have, survivors, people who've experienced crime themselves, or they've had a loved one who's experienced crime. We know that you all are busy doing a lot of stuff, and policy takes a lot of work, and so we take the charge that as a statewide organization, looking at statewide policy issues and to some extent federal policy issues is a part of how we can be helpful as a membership organization. So we have, as I mentioned before, we have about 20 people that are parts of our policy committee. They are people that tend to be, they're veterans in their areas of expertise. We definitely folks who are able to, they don't focus narrowly on, parts of single issues. They're folks that are able to think very, very broadly about policy and all the different implications that policy can have. We do ongoing work with legislators all year round, and other groups that also influence policy and work very heavily on policy issues. We do quite a bit of monitoring and participate in groups like the Sex Offender Management Board, also known as the SOMB, and the Colorado Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, also called the CCJJ, and different legislative interim committees. So policy gets decided by many groups that aren't necessarily elected officials. elected officials have their own interests and the things that they want to carry forth based on what they hear from their constituents and things that they ran and were elected to take care of, and they don't do it alone. A lot of groups will sometimes such as COVA, will sometimes bring forward ideas for legislation, assist in putting together draft language, and that's some of the back work that happens with public policy. We do a lot of coordination with other groups such as Colorado Victims for Justice. That is a grassroots volunteer group of all survivors of crime and people, loved ones, parents and family members of people who've experienced crime. They meet once a month at COVA. For those of you who, if anybody out there who has experienced crime and maybe would like to get involved, or if you are a victim advocate or somebody in the work with crime victims and you know somebody that has been looking for ways to get involved, please feel free to send them my way, and I'll hook that person in with Victims for Justice. They do great work. We also work with the Colorado District Attorneys Council, more commonly known as CDAC, and we also work closely with the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CCASA, and the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, or CCADV. So one of the things that our policy committee asks that I share with you is we want you to know that by the time we send out our action alerts, all other avenues have been exhausted, and we really do need your help. We try to be mindful about how often we send out call for action or policy alerts. We don't want to ever be we never want to be the organization that cried wolf too many times and that we burn you out and we start to drown ourselves out. But I need to tell you that most of the work that we do on public policy happens in the background. We prefer to have most of our discussions, disagreements, and challenging, the challenging work tends to happen out of the Capitol, one-on-one, out of committee hearings, and really we try to have our differences worked out before things are kind of aired in a public setting. So I guess as we're going to be gearing up for the legislative session, I'm hopeful that you're all signed up for emails from COVA and also from CCADV and CCASA. By the time you do get those action alerts, we really do need your help. So that's definitely one of the few things I hope that you can take away from today. So some of what we expect to see in 2018. It is going to be a challenging year for advocating for the rights of crime victims. Our work is nonpartisan, and that is because crime victimization, it doesn't know a political party, and it has the potential to affect all of us, all of our loved ones. Unfortunately, partisan politics does influence what happens down at the Capitol, and so we do have a divided legislature. The House has a Democratic majority. The Senate has a very slim Republican majority. The reason that matters is that sometimes there are bills that are just going to be a little bit more palatable for the Democratic Party as a whole or the Republican Party as a whole. Or sometimes there are bills that are going to kind of go against the party, the governing kind of thoughts of the party. And so sometimes there are bills that just fail based on where the party is putting their priorities. And so that is just, it's challenging. I wish that it weren't that way, but it's a reality that we do sometimes have to contend with. We do know that there are going to be bills coming from the sentencing in the Criminal Justice System Interim Study Committee, which we followed very closely over the summer, and the County Courthouse and County Jail Funding and Overcrowding Solutions Interim Study Committee. That is really hard to say all at once. We did not follow that committee very closely. We ended up having some folks from the parole board who came to us and gave us some insight about some of the things that were being considered. And so we know there's going to be legislation coming from that group, and we'll definitely be having to pay attention to that and probably play a little bit of catch up. We know that there are going to be efforts to limit or repeal mandatory minimum sentences. We know there will be efforts to revise laws around sentencing, monitoring, and treatment of convicted sex offenders. And thankfully, we know that there will be also some bills that will be helpful for crime victims and survivors. So we just know that it's going to be, we're going to have our work cut out for us this year. So some of the contextual backdrop, again, nothing happens in a vacuum. And you've been paying attention to local and state news at all, you know that there's been a lot of public awareness and media coverage of sexual harassment at the federal level, but also at the state capitol. I believe at this point there's been 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans who have been accused of sexually harassing behavior. There has been side issues with, there was a representative who called on the Democratic speaker to step down from her position for promoting somebody who had been accused to a leadership position. There's very likely going to be consultants that will be brought in to evaluate the sexual harassment policies and the response policies. We know that any of us that work with survivors when it comes to, particularly crimes of domestic violence and sex assault, we know that the people who come forward are just the tip of the iceberg. So if this is a culture problem within the Capitol, we also know that there's probably other people who've experienced things that might be feeling a little triggered. There's probably some trauma, and it's probably going to affect the tone of how at least the session will start off. There's also going to be a big challenge around PARA, which is the Public Employees Retirement Association. That doesn't affect all of us, but it affects about 1 in 10 people in Colorado. And long story short, PARA is going broke. About 7 years ago, there was a big reform effort that imposed some pretty serious austerity measures to PARA, and now there's still challenges, and basically it's a big stopgap. And so people who are currently receiving PARA, people who will get PARA in the future, taxpayers who don't have anything to do with PARA but may end up having to have limited government services or have to pay more. It's a big, challenging, messy topic that is going to, even though it doesn't affect crime victims, it is going to affect the conversations that are happening, especially when it comes to anything that's going to cost money. There's also, there could be some after effects of a unsuccessful special session. Last year, the hot topic was, actually for 2 years, there was the hospital provider fees. That was a big issue. There was some partisan stuff that went on with that, but there was a decision to take some of the, it had to do with Senate Bill 267. It was a spending measure that overhauled a state hospital funding program and rewrote the state's pot tax laws. But there was a mistake in how the law that was written, and it cut funding from RTD, which is our transit body in at least the metro, the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, and some other organizations, and it kept them from collecting money from recreational pot taxes. Special session was called. It was the first one in 5 years, and nothing got done. And so there will probably be some after effects from that because it didn't end well. And then lastly, something that happens every year is we always seem to be in a budget shortfall, and Governor Hickenlooper's budget that has been proposed is that we need to start cutting money and we need to start saving money. There was a study that basically said that Colorado isn't in a position to weather even a moderate recession, and that we need to start saving more. And so that makes anything that costs money a very challenging conversation. And frankly, there are some things that we want to see happen that we'll talk about in a little bit that are going to cost some money. And so we'll have to figure that out when we get there. The other part of the contextual backdrop is, for anyone out there who enjoys watching a scandal, everyone thinks they are wearing the white hat. And it took me a few years of going down to the Capitol to really get that in my head, that no one goes down there thinking, I'm going to be a real stinker and I'm just really going to stick it to these poor crime victims and survivors, and I'm really just going down there to do all the wrong things. Everyone thinks that they are doing the right thing. And so that sometimes makes things challenging when you have an entire building full of people who are in this high-stress environment and everybody thinks that they're right, including COVA. But we're right? Yeah, we are wearing a white hat. We'll just say that. The other thing that's challenging is that issues that have a lot of shades of gray challenging issues, complex issues get drilled down to being discussed and decided on in very black and white terms. Complex issues sometimes become oversimplified, and that's just due to the hurried nature of the legislative process. It feels like there's never enough time, and just the process itself is not conducive to measured discussions and really getting into the weeds. And it is what it is, but that is something that you just need to be aware of as you're getting involved in this work. So, some of what we're going to talk about is, as I mentioned, the Sentencing in the Criminal Justice System Interim Study Committee. That one's a little easier to say than the other one. So this is the one that COVA followed very carefully over the summer. This committee was created via legislation that was sponsored by Representative Pete Lee, who was also the chair of this committee. The charge of the committee was that they would consider and evaluate the use of mandatory minimum sentences in Colorado, consider and evaluate the continued viability of extraordinary risk crimes, examine the current habitual offender scheme, and consider the development of second-look legislation that would address long sentences where prison placement is no longer in the interest of public safety and does not further the interest of justice. So that charge had some concerning aspects to COVA right from the front end. There's been particularly, coming from the governor's office, but also some of the legislatures at the Capitol, there's been a lot of focus about why are we spending so much on incarceration. And to be fair, there are very real social justice and there are things that do need to be changed and things that the system is not perfect. We all know that. And I think that COVA has seen over the years, there's been a real shift towards letting letting people out in maybe not the most thoughtful way, policies that don't seem to kind of be moving the wagons forward in a very thoughtful process. We just had some concerns from the front end about what this committee was going to attempt to do, but we were hopeful. So we had the opportunity to come and present to the committee about what victims experience when they go through the post-sentencing process. And so we were able to pull in a victim advocate who works with the Department of Corrections. Our executive director, Nancy Lewis, came and presented. We had somebody with Victim Services Network here in Denver, and we had the executive director of the Rocky Mountain Victim Law Center come and talk about what victims are experiencing. What we brought forward was, and as many of you probably know, we have a very strong Victims' Rights Act in Colorado that, if you've been a victim of a VRA crime, you will get information and notification about what's happening with your case all the way up until sentencing. Then it switches to a system where you have to say, I want to continue to receive information. And so that is an opt-in process. We have found that that was actually something that was done intentionally because back when the VRA was passed, folks really did think that victims would want maybe to have the option of just not, just stepping away, and that they could continue to get information if they so chose. What we didn't anticipate was that a lot of people would get very confused. Sentencing is an emotional time for people. Basically, a lot of people got dropped off, and they didn't realize that they had to opt back in, and they didn't realize that they were missing parole hearings and all of these other things until maybe they ran, a dramatic example is that you run into your offender in the grocery store, and suddenly you're going, what the heck, I thought that this person was supposed to be incarcerated for 20 years. Oh, but you didn't know that there were earn time and good time calculations and all of these confusing things that layer on top of each other. We brought that to the committee. And so there was that kind of set the stage at the beginning for describing a lack of transparency and a lot of confusion in the system, not just for victims, but also for offenders, for even people who are professionals working in the system. And so we were hopeful when we started hearing these themes that were coming forward. And then we saw the list of proposals that this committee has moved forth. They proposed 19 bills, which were all drafted. This committee was only allowed to move forward 5 of them. However, each one of those legislators can also bring forward, as a lead sponsor, 5 bills. So technically, even though that committee is only going to, only 5 bills move forward with the blessing of this committee, anything that they brought forward could technically be run by one of those individual legislators. So here's what they decided they wanted to focus on. Bill A, create determinate sentence for indeterminate sex offenses. Bill B, sentences for habitual criminals. Bill C, reauthorize the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, or the CCJJ. Bill D, lower mandatory parole from 5 years to 3 years. And Bill E, redo a criminal sentencing study that was last done in 2007 and basically redo it to give some new data to inform the CCJJ. So we're going to just talk briefly about most of these. So the first one, well, let's actually talk a little bit first about, so some of the bills that were not recommended to Legislative Council. We had some pretty big concerns about a lot of these. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but there are quite a few of them we're going to limit. There was actually one bill that would have completely negated the need for a parole board. There were definitely bills around expungement and sealing. That second look criminal sentencing one was pretty scary because it was basically going to be that somebody could get sentenced and then 5 years, at a certain point they could ask to have their sentence reevaluated, and then so they could maybe have their sentence reduced or I doubt increased, but then they would be eligible to have that happen every 5 years. So it was not just a second look, it was a third, fourth, fifth look. And survivors were going to get put through that trauma constantly. Limiting the number of beds in DOC, we do have a lot of people who are incarcerated, but at the same time, by just putting a cap on it, there could be some concerns with that. So just a lot of stuff that were really concerning, and they seem to contradict with each other. And so, again, be warned, sometimes these things come back, and especially individual legislators could pick these bills up because they've already been drafted. They already have fiscal notes, which is a word for how much it's going to cost. So we're kind of just waiting to see which ones of these we may end up seeing again. So some of COVA's concerns about the bills that have been, okay. So some of I'm going to jump around from my slides. Sometimes I like to change things up on the fly. So some of COVA's concerns about the bills that were proposed and some of the bills that have come out were that they appeared to be reiterations of past efforts that failed to gain approval by the General Assembly or the CCJJ because they were not sound public policy. We'll jump back here in a minute to Bill A, that one about creating determinate sentences for indeterminate sex offenses. That was a bill that was drafted last year by Senator Irene Aguilar. She's my senator. I had contacted her repeatedly about this one. It died in its first committee hearing. And so we're a little concerned that this was something that just was brought back, even though it didn't make it through, and there's been concerns every time there's been attempts about this issue. It didn't appear that the topic of many of the bills, that full list of 19, was even discussed during the 5 hearings that the committee held over the summer, at least not to the extent that their inclusion, there should be inclusion in there, would indicate. A number of the bills appear to advance policy contrary to testimony and discussion during multiple committee hearings, particularly that lack of transparency, that lack of accountability, and confusion that so many people are experiencing. And again, one of the recurring themes was that clarity and certainty, and that some of those bills appear to move in the opposite direction. So those were our overarching concerns. So we're going to jump back here. Sorry about the back and forth a little bit. Sometimes you got to change things up once you start talking. So the way that the Bill A is worded, and I will when we share the link to the, could we also maybe put a link so people could access the bills? I hadn't thought about that as having them as attachments. We'll make it possible for you all to see the bill language since it's already out there. But basically the argument is that judges are not appropriately sentencing sex offenders because they don't want to give them an indeterminate sentence, and then that results in judges getting backlash by saying that they're giving sex offenders too light of sentences. And that's maybe something that we don't totally agree on. There's also a premise within this bill that most sex offenders are not repeat offenders, which we have a very well-versed researcher, expert witness named Jean McAllister on our policy committee, who, if she says that is true, if you only look at recidivism in about 2 years, which most of the studies that come forward that support getting rid of our indeterminate sentencing scheme for sex offenders, if you go out 10 years, 25 years, most people who are prone to commit sex offenses, they do tend to they create other victims. They reoffend unless there is, treatment, monitoring, and pretty stringent treatment and monitoring. So that is that's going to be a complicated bill. There is definitely the political will to get rid of indeterminate sentencing for sex offenses. That was a law that was created in the 90s, and unfortunately, it has never fully been implemented the way that it was intended. And what was intended was that if you commit certain levels of sex offenses, you will be incarcerated for an indeterminate period of time, but you will receive treatment and treatment and monitoring, and there will be a reassessment about whether there's been accountability, the level of risk that that person posed to public safety, and that the release date would be determined based on that individual need. In theory, that would have been fantastic, but the resources were never really fully put into it, and so it hasn't worked the way that it was meant to. So we're going to be watching that one very, very closely, being very engaged on that. Bill B has to do with sentences for habitual criminals. We have another very smart individual on our policy committee named Joe Kanata. He runs a program called Voices of Victims. They provide post-sentencing support for people who have an incarcerated offender. And my understanding of this is that this would limit the types of crimes that could be eligible for a habitual criminal sentence. So basically, if somebody keeps committing crimes, felony crimes, they could get a stiffer penalty because they keep committing habitual crimes. And this would limit the types of crimes, but Joe has also said that this is a law that isn't utilized a ton by district attorneys anyway. So we're probably going to be following the Colorado District Attorney Council's lead on this one, but we'll definitely be involved because it would affect people who are our constituents. Bill C has to do with reauthorizing the CCJJ. CCJJ is a challenging body it was created with very good intentions under Governor Bill Ritter, and it was basically to create a think tank of people who understood the criminal justice process very well to create very sound criminal justice reform. It sounds like some of the early work was definitely something to be proud of. It's a large body. I think it's at least 20 people, possibly more. There is only one victims representative. There are 2 community representative spots. As time has gone on, those have been occupied by defense attorneys or people who have a past work history in criminal defense, which we have some problems with. There's also been some question about how effective they are. We're not going to fight too hard on it, but we will probably ask some questions about what will the expectations be. We would definitely like to see the makeup of the CCJJ differ a little bit. We're concerned that victims' voices are marginalized on that committee. We also have a problem with the way that they vote. They're allowed to vote yes, no, or I can live with it, and the I can live with it votes are counted as yes votes. When they get down to the Capitol, that creates problems when a bill is said to have passed the CCJJ, but maybe there were only a handful of yes votes, the bulk of them were I could live with it, and then a handful of no votes. And we would like to see that maybe be a little bit more transparent. A bill that we are still exploring what the impact would be for crime victims has to do with lowering mandatory parole from 5 years to 3 years. We've spoken with some people at the parole board who think that this one might not, that it seems to be in line with research that's out there. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that very few, when somebody is sentenced, let's say just for 20 years, they are not going to serve 20 years. Depending on the type of crime, they are more likely to, I'm going to ask Jen to help me with this, I think they're likely to serve anywhere from 35 to 50% of a sentence. Is that correct? Do you remember that? That's okay. I caught her unaware. That was not fair of me. So basically, there are very, very confusing time computations for people who are sentenced to the Department of Corrections. There's earned time. There's good time. There's your mandatory parole eligibility date. There's confusion about when you can apply to be, or you can possibly be paroled, or you could be moved to community corrections, which is, it's very confusing. And so for us, we would like to know if lowering mandatory parole for 5 years to 3 years, is there still those weird time computations? Would 3 years suddenly become just like a year? Would it be a year and a half? So we have some questions. We just have some questions about that one. And lastly, CCJJ conducted a criminal sentencing study in 2007 that it was something that really guided a big push at the legislature, for good reason, is that policy should be driven by data and research, which is fine. But one of the things that we have learned is Victim Services has never had much of an investment in counting our experiences. And if you aren't counted, you literally don't count in the decisions. And so it's sometimes hard to talk when all you have are anecdotes, and you can have, you know, a room full of survivors who can talk about their experiences, and then you have someone say, yeah, but you don't have any numbers. It's a challenging situation to be in. So the charge, or this particular bill is basically looking at the most evidence-based effective sentencing strategies, and I'm hoping that we can figure out a way to make sure that victims' experiences are also a part of that conversation. So that is what we know is coming. I know that was a very quick overview. I will make sure that we have a link to, there's a place where you can read all of these bills, little light reading before bed.
We send that out to folks through the chat, and we'll send it out in the follow-up.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And definitely more to come on Bill A. I think that is one that we will definitely be engaged on, because we just want to make sure that public safety and the experiences of survivors, sex assault survivors, are taken seriously in this whole conversation. So, some of the responses thus far. I'm going to preface this by reading that headline at the top. A spike in felony crimes has Colorado prosecutors pushing back against sentencing and parole reforms. There has been an interesting, we're just going to roll this little news clip, and I'll do any follow-up. Jen is helping me because I realize I'm not sure what to do here. Okay.
Colorado's district attorneys want state lawmakers to hold off for now on reforming criminal justice. That's after new data shows felony cases are up nearly 30% in the past 2 years. Political specialist Sean Boyd on the story at the Capitol. Sean, let's talk about that spike in cases first. Any explanation for it?
Part of it is violent crime that's up 12%. The population has also increased, but that doesn't explain a 30% spike. District attorneys say it would be reckless to move ahead with reforms until they have answers, but the lawmaker leading the reform has no intention of backing off. They're the worst of the worst crimes: murder, rape, aggravated assault, and the number of Coloradans being charged with them is skyrocketing.
We want to figure out why. Let's not rush forward with more reforms until we know why.
Tom Raines with the Colorado District Attorney's Council says virtually every jurisdiction in the state has seen felony cases rise by 20, 40, 60, even 90% over the last 5 years. The increases come as state lawmakers have enacted reforms lessening sentences for some crimes and making it harder to revoke parole in others.
We're not saying there's a correlation, but we don't know. So when you talk about new legislation that potentially lets felony conduct get a lighter sentence or get out of prison earlier, let's put on the brakes.
It just doesn't make sense to just stop everything because one has some question. You know, the people who really ought to know best why they're filing more cases are the people filing more cases.
Senator Daniel Kagan is leading many of the reforms. He says there's no evidence to suggest any of those passed or being considered contribute to more felonies.
It may well be that prosecutors feel an obligation to go forward with more cases, particularly in the area of sexual assault.
Contrary to the popular narrative that we create felony cases, we can't do that. We've got to go forward with cases that we have a reasonable likelihood of conviction on.
The president of the District Attorney's Council, Boulder DA Stan Garnett, met with the governor's office to talk about the increase. He says they want to understand things like how much of it is tied to pot or opioids and how many of the defendants are repeat offenders or parolees. Bills dealing with sentencing for habitual offenders and sex offenders among those being considered. Live at the Capitol, Sean Boyd, covering Colorado first. Sean, thank you.
So that just gives a little taste of some of the, what people in the field are experiencing. At a certain point, we'll be polling those of you who are on the webinar with us to find out a little bit about who you are. And I'm guessing we probably have some folks that are law enforcement victim advocates, maybe some folks who work in prosecution. And again, this is anecdotes, but people, y'all are busy. There has been, it feels like there have been a lot more serious crimes, and that spike in felony filings is definitely something that people, our constituency and people who are in the field, have been taking note of. And we do have questions, because we have been doing policy for so long, and we've started to see a lot of these sentencing reforms that have been happening over particularly the past 7-8 years. At a certain point you start to wonder, like when you start to see how things are getting stacked on top of each other, and that it's harder to revoke people on parole, and that there's all of these bills that are passed, and again, they're not part of a cohesive strategy. And again, we also have some questions, as do the Colorado district attorneys around the state. And so we're going to be paying attention, and we do work well with CDAC, and we'll be just, we work together during the legislative process, even when we don't always see eye to eye. And I'm having a hard time clicking forward, so Jen's going to help me again. I'm very grateful that she's here for many reasons. Okay. So here's the warm, fuzzy part of the presentation, bills that could be good for crime victims. And I decided to have pictures of animals hugging because that always makes me feel better. So some things that, again, these are bills that could be coming, bills that could be good for crime victims. Sometimes things are, introduced in one way and then they get changed through the legislative process, and sometimes they end up different than what you were anticipating. So the two bills at the top are bills that we know are coming from the Attorney General's office. One is their changes to revenge porn crimes. So currently, the bill summary is that currently Colorado criminalizes posting nude images of another person for harassment purposes, or for money game. I can't pronounce the word that's here. So the bill
Pecuniary.
Thank you, Jen. Another reason I'm glad she's here. So the bill makes the following changes to these crimes. It adds images of sex acts that may not include nude images, criminalizes threatening to disclose a nude image or image showing a sex act, removes the requirement that the defendant intended to inflict serious emotional distress, removes as an exception to the crimes that the image relates to a newsworthy event, and also clarifies that the images subject to the crimes could be disclosed by law enforcement and a few other professions in the course of their job. So my understanding is this is more clarifying kind of cleanup with a law that was passed a while ago, and just sometimes that happens. You learn from what has happened. You pass a law, you learn about what's going well and what's not, and you change things. So that's one that we think will be good for survivors of that type of crime. Another bill that's coming from the AG's office has to do with updates for protective orders, criminal protective orders specifically, and this is going to clarify that that animals cannot be. It has to clarify around order prohibiting the taking, transferring, concealing, harming, disposing, or threatening to harm an animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by the alleged victim or witness. It's basically trying to add another layer of protection that exists in civil protection orders but is not there for criminal, that protects family pets, and animals. And there's also some cleanup that would protect telephone numbers, cell phone numbers. And so my understanding of how this is written is that basically it would require a provider to transfer to the petitioner of the protective order a telephone number that's used either by the petitioner or a minor child. And it would also add some protections around that the defendant can't just, cut off payments for that as well. So this one is still in draft form and might change a little bit, but again, has really good intentions for crime victims. Another one that we know is coming, I have not seen a draft, but we have a meeting set with the sponsor, Senator Kafalis, is that there is going to be a bill moving forward that provides some immunity for minor victims of sex trafficking. Some folks may know that COVA has run a human trafficking program. We provide intensive case management for survivors of both labor and sex trafficking. Something that we always are talking to legislators about is our labor trafficking survivors are more often than not, they are forgotten about, and they are not included in any discussion or about laws that are being moved forward about human trafficking. So I put in here, opinions vary about whether immunity is a good thing. There are some schools of thought that when you provide immunity for minor victims of sex trafficking, and the immunity could be for any crimes that are committed by those for those victims, or immunity for victims where the crime that they committed was part of their trafficking situation. You know, the devil's in the details with this type of stuff. There's some school of thought that if minors get immunity, they are going to be targeted even more by traffickers. I think things are changing a little bit with that, but it is definitely a school of thought. There's also this would definitely force the hand of pushing more housing options for minor victims of sex trafficking. A lot of these kids are incarcerated because there is literally nowhere else to put them. A lot of them end up being in diversion programs, which technically, if they're victims of sex trafficking, they can't and they shouldn't be charged with prostitution-related crimes, and yet a lot of them end up in diversion programs as a way to, it is with good intentions of keeping them safe, helping them to get sober and things like that, and yet it is still a criminal penalty. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because it really gets into a question of values. And for us, for COVA, we would really like to see some protections for victims of labor trafficking. We definitely have had some victims some clients who they have been victimized, they've been used for drug trafficking, and they end up getting criminal penalties. And I think that there's been some really good efforts around diversion and creating some change for individual cases. But again, our clients, our labor trafficking clients, are very often left out of the discussion when it comes to changing laws. So we're going to try to see if we can get a little movement on that. There's also going to be a bill moving forward that would require training on human trafficking for commercial drivers, which is, again, I've heard some folks that have some concerns about whether it would look at all prostitution as trafficking, which it's not, and so that's something that we'll keep an eye out. But in general, we're pretty hopeful that this will be, that it might be a very helpful thing for an industry that could come in contact with trafficking victims and maybe create some good change there. Something that we would like to see happen, and we're working on, although we're far from having an acceptable draft ready, clarifying victim notification requirements when incarcerated offenders are moved out of state. This is specific to high-profile cases like the Aurora Theater shooter, who was moved out of state, and the victims in that case wanted to know where he was, and they were not given, they were not afforded their rights under the VRA. And the justification was because the Interstate Compact, which is basically an MOU between our Department of Corrections and several other Department of Corrections, didn't allow that. We think that victims should have their rights upheld under the Victims' Rights Act, which it says very clearly that victims shall receive notification of where their offender has been moved if they so want that information. And so we are working on a fix for this. We're hopeful that we can make this better for folks. And then that opt-out victim notification system that I talked about earlier, which we brought to the attention of the Sentencing Committee, we were hopeful that this might be one of their 5 bills that they moved forward. It did not make it onto their list of even 19. We are moving forward with trying to figure out, get a bill drafted, and we know it's going to cost a lot of money. It would be a huge workload increase for state judicial and for the Department of Corrections, but it's also the right thing to do for crime victims. So even if we are not successful this year, we are hopeful that we will at least be able to start the conversation and maybe get the ball rolling, if not this year, then maybe next year. So Another wonderful thing that we have happening in Colorado is the Colorado Victims' Rights Caucus. It was founded in 2013, and it was co-sponsored by then Representatives Rhonda Fields, who's a Democrat, and Bob Gardner, who's a Republican. And the caucus has endeavored to serve as the General Assembly's subject matter experts in ensuring that the rights of crime victims are appropriately balanced in the consideration of criminal justice policy. That's a lot of words to basically say we want legislators to start thinking about how this will affect crime victims when they are looking at criminal justice policy. So we have evolved over the years, and we now have bipartisan sponsorship in both the House and the Senate. We have our representatives of back in the day are now Senators Bob Gardner and Senator Rhonda Fields. We also have Representative Polly Lawrence, who's a Republican from down in for Douglas and Teller County, and Representative Dominique Jackson from Arapahoe has joined us this year as a sponsor in the House of Representatives. So we're pretty excited about that. So this is getting into the part of how you can get involved and stay involved. Our tentative schedule for the caucus, we have some pictures of caucuses from previous years. We're hoping to start at the end of January. Session starts the second week of January, so we figured we'd give it a couple weeks before we started trying to really focus on, get their attention on what's happening for crime victims and survivors. All of these dates are Wednesdays, so January 31st, February 14th, March 14th, April 11th. I've been talking too long. My words are starting to get jumbled. All meetings will be held at the Capitol from noon to 1 p.m. Locations will be to be determined. Live streaming will be available. We're planning on, in January, we will be talking about indeterminate sex offenses. We will be talking about the research from a more victim-centered perspective than we've seen in the past. We try to always have a survivor present who can talk about what they are experiencing. February 14th is Valentine's Day. We are thinking we'd like to have a conversation about domestic violence and mass shootings. There's some pretty interesting research that's out there, and we'd just like to have a conversation about that since it's something that keeps happening as much as we wish it wouldn't. And we're still kind of figuring out the details for March and April. We typically like to see what happens when session starts so we can make sure that what we're planning is timely to what legislators need. So here's a fact. Legislators aren't going to come unless you ask them to. That is something that we have learned over, we've been doing this is our 6th year, and I will tell you, we had a fantastic presentation last January. I think we had 3 legislators who showed up, and 2 of those were our sponsors. And the times that we are most successful, and I got to tell you, we're bringing top-notch education, people who are experts in the field, we're coming to them, we're bringing lunch, because if you give people food, typically they tend to stick around or come to hear what you have to say. And unless your legislators hear from you that it's important to you as one of their constituents that you attend, they probably aren't going to show up. So for folks who are new in this process, the very first question is, how do I find out who my state senator and representative is? You can go to, there's a website there, so ledge.colorado.gov/findmylegislator, or another one that's a little easier is openstates.org. And every email blast that we send, we will send out information about the caucus and all of our action alerts. We always have openstates.org as a link that's in there. So before the caucus, please send them a quick email inviting them. You will get the information 1 to 2 weeks before the caucus. And after the caucus, call or email to thank them for attending. You are able to remote in. You just live stream in for a little bit, see if they're there. If they didn't attend, you can ask them to put next month's meeting on their calendar. You can also, as their constituent, you can also ask them why they didn't attend. Oftentimes it's because of competing schedules and priorities. We get that, but it's also, they need to hear from you that it is something that you want them to make a priority. So here's a little bit of here's the pep talk. A little reminder about democracy. Democracy is not simply a license to indulge individual whims and proclivities. It's also holding oneself accountable to some reasonable degree for the conditions of peace and chaos that impact the lives of those who inhabit one's beloved extended community. Another way of putting that is that you get the democracy that you deserve. And the reality is that we have very low voter turnout for our elections. A lot of people choose to, every time I run into somebody who says, I don't do politics, that I feel myself getting red in the face, because if we don't, the reality is that people across the world fight very, very hard to have the ability to be civically engaged in the way that we have. And many of us choose to not be engaged because it's hard, and I get that. So we're hoping we'll talk a little bit about the end about how at COVA we're going to try to make that a little easier, but please, please, please figure out how you can be engaged, because we need you. So the ways that you can get prepared and stay engaged at this juncture, because we don't yet know what's going to happen once January hits, please remember you have the right to be civically engaged. Something that makes me so sad is when people, they feel like they are stifled from being engaged because of the jobs that they have. We got to work, right? You have the right to find out the policies at your job when it comes to being politically active. And if those policies don't exist, you have the right to talk to your supervisor about, getting some guidance, whether it's taking some time off, taking if you work shift work, you do have the right to, 15-minute breaks every 4 hours. You can make 2 phone calls in 5 minutes. You can send an email from your phone or, in the evening time. And also for those who work in nonprofits, this is something that I spent a good chunk of my I have a master's degree that sounds like I got it out of a popcorn bottle of Cracker Jacks, or a box of Cracker Jacks. It's a master's in advocacy and political leadership. But I spent a lot of time focusing on how nonprofits can be politically active. You have the right to conduct policy work and to provide education on issues that affect your mission. There's something called the no substantial part test. Basically, if less than 5% of what you are focusing on is policy, you're good. If you want to do a lot of policy, you can take what's called the 501H election, which is something that an agency like COVA does, because we do actively lobby and we do education. And a wonderful resource where you can actually talk with an attorney who can tell you, they can give you advice on policies. They are such a wonderful resource. It's called Boulder Advocacy, and it's just boulderadvocacy.org. Now, one of the things that also makes me very sad is there are particular challenges for people who work in government and the criminal justice system. Some folks have very understanding supervisors. They're like, yep, you have the real world experience. Of course you should be able to go down and share that. People who work in state government are particularly stifled, and that is something that's really happened under Governor Hickenlooper, who came in with a perspective that people who work in government shouldn't be deciding the types of laws that are being moved forth. I'm probably paraphrasing, but I get it as a theory, but what has happened is that there has been an inability for people with very important, crucial information who have not been able to come down to speak to, what these changes, what these bills and, proposed legislation would actually mean for people. So I'm hopeful that, those of you who do work in state government or more restrictive systems-based environments, you still have the right to get clear guidelines from your place of employment, and you have the right to be civically engaged. And Boulder Advocacy might be able to be a resource for you as well. And if you are having particular challenges, give me a call. You'll have my contact information, and we're happy to problem solve with you if you have a perspective that is really, really needed on one of the issues being considered. So once more with feeling, if there's anything that you can take away from all of this stuff, make sure you are signed. These are the easiest things that you can do right now. Make sure you're signed up for emails from COVA, CCASA, and CCADV. We all do action alerts. We all send out information about the policy stuff that is affecting crime victims. And we typically send out those action alerts after all other options have been exhausted, and we'll tell you exactly what we need and give you all the information that you want so you can make an informed decision. Please, please, please invite your state senators and representatives to the Victims' Rights Caucus. They won't come unless you ask them. And most importantly, please, please, please remember that you have the right and the obligation to be civically engaged. And with that, you go get them, Tiger. And if there are any questions that Jen hasn't been able to answer, I've seen her typing furiously, we're happy to take those now.
Yeah, thank you all for sticking with us. And yeah, definitely let me know if you have any questions. I did send out a couple of links as we were going along to where those bills that we referenced from the Interim Sentencing Committee can be found. I'll also send those links out in follow-up, and send out a link to our website where you can get signed up for our email newsletter. I know that CCASA and CCADV are also going to be putting on their LEAD event in February, which is a day of education around how to get involved in legislation, talk through some of these different restrictions around lobbying and legislative advocacy, as well as kind of provide some opportunities to actually meet with your legislature. So definitely get connected with CCASA and CCADV. Make sure that you're signed up to get policy alerts from these agencies and other agencies across the state that are doing work that may impact you, may impact crime victims, but there's lots and lots of good stuff being done. So anything that we can do to help you be engaged, definitely let us know. There is a question here, does COVA participate in the Sex Offender Management Board? Sterling, what is our kind of participation level there?
So we have a member of our board of directors, and she's also a member of our public policy committee. Her name is Allison Boyd, and she is she serves as a victim representative on the SOMB. And so she is definitely someone who brings a lot of information to COVA. And the ways that COVA gets involved with the SOMB is Allison keeps us posted. She's in the trenches, and we go and observe as much as we are able. And when there are changes or there's particular meetings of interest, we'll show up and get involved and speak. But our boots on the ground is definitely Allison.
Yeah. Other questions out there? Another thing that came to my mind as we were talking today is we primarily today were focused on state policy updates. And while that is where most of COVA's policy work happens, is at this state level, we do also send out policy alerts when there are things happening at the federal level that will impact crime victims. So keep that in mind as well, and there are other agencies that you can get involved in. Again, we can send out some more links around how to find your representatives, but there are often things related to tax bills or things around like VOCA funding that are happening at the federal level that have a dramatic impact on crime victims in our state and across the country. So although that's not where our focus has been today, just know that we do keep an eye on that stuff, and we'll let you know when we need help.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to add more, but there'll be, just make sure you're signed up for COVA's emails, and then whatever we have, we're committed to sending it out as quickly as we can and letting you know how you can get involved, because we need you. It's a big job. Anything else?
I'm not seeing any additional questions at this point. You have Sterling's contact information there on the screen. You all have my contact information through registering for the webinar. So again, we appreciate you joining us today, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions after this or want to know more. If you ever have suggestions on topics that you'd like to see on webinars or trainings in person, we're trying to offer these things monthly and want to get you all as much information about resources and other things happening across the state as possible. So stay in touch with us and go forth and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.